Tonight, the question nobody wants to answer. How did ordinary people watch democracy die and let it happen? There is a question that has been asked about the 1930s ever since the 1930s ended. How did they not see it? How did ordinary people, educated people, people with jobs and families and newspapers and the full apparatus of modern civilization, watch democracy collapse across the continent and not stop it? How did they vote for it in some cases? How did they let it happen? The answer is more uncomfortable than most people can sit with. Because the answer is not that people in the 1930s were uniquely stupid, or uniquely cruel, or somehow fundamentally different from the people now. The answer is that the conditions were right. The fear was real. The exhaustion was real. The institutions that were supposed to hold had been too weak for too long, and the men who offered certainty in a world that had produced nothing but chaos for 15 years were very, very good at what they did. This is not an excuse. It is something more important than an excuse. It is an explanation. And explanations matter. Because things that can be explained can, in theory, be recognized when they begin to happen again. Last time, we finished with Hitler becoming Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. But that is only one part of this story, and not even the beginning of it. Because by the time Hitler came to power, Europe had already been watching a template for more than a decade. That template was Italy. And the man who built it was a former socialist journalist from a small town in Romagna who had decided at some point in the wreckage of the First World War that the future belonged to men who were willing to use force without hesitation. His name was Benito Mussolini, and he was the first. Italy in 1919 was a country in crisis, and the crisis had a particular quality that made it different from the crises of the other defeated nations. Italy had not been defeated. Italy had won, and that was somehow worse. Italy had entered the war in 1915 on a promise. A secret treaty with Britain and France that offered generous territorial rewards in exchange for joining the Allied side. The war cost Italy somewhere around 650,000 dead, and that is the figure most commonly cited. Some recent work puts it higher. When it was over, the men who had survived came home to discover that the promises had not been kept. The territory they had been promised, along the Adriatic coast in Dalmatia, was not going to be delivered. The peace conference, working from Wilson's principle of national self-determination, decided that the populations of those regions were not Italian enough to simply be handed to Italy. The poet and nationalist Gabriele D'Annunzio gave the feeling its name: Vittoria mutilata, the mutilated victory. Now, was it accurate? Probably not. Or not entirely. Italy had received a great deal. The mutilated victory was more political myth than measurable fact. But, as a political tool, as an expression of something felt by millions of returning soldiers and their families, it was extraordinarily effective. Italy had bled for a result that felt like nothing. The government that had made the promises couldn't deliver. The men who had fought felt their sacrifice had been treated as worthless. Into that feeling stepped Mussolini. He had been a socialist journalist before the war, a man of the left, a man of words. The war had changed him, as it changed so many. He came back from the front convinced that the era of class struggle was over, that the future was national struggle, that the energy of the veterans, the anger, the violence, the willingness to act, could be channeled into something that would make Italy great again. In March 1919, he gathered 100 men in the square of Milan. They called themselves the Fasci di Combattimento, the combat bands. They wore black shirts. They beat up socialists. Within 3 years, there were 300,000 of them. What Mussolini understood, and what the liberal government in Rome failed to understand until it was too late, was that the squadristi, his paramilitary thugs, were performing a service that frightened people wanted performing. The socialist unions had been staging strikes. The cities had been turbulent. The countryside had been tense with land seizures and labour disputes. The industrialists and the landowners, terrified of what had just happened in Russia, wanted someone to put a stop to it. The liberal politicians, wedded to parliamentary procedure, could not. Mussolini's black shirts could. They burned union halls. They beat labour leaders. They poured castor oil down the throats of socialists as a humiliation. They killed perhaps 2,000 political opponents between 1919 and 1922. And the government mostly looked the other way, because the business class and the landowners who funded that government were quietly relieved. This is how it worked. This is how it always works. By October 1922, Mussolini had decided that the moment had come. He issued an ultimatum: hand over the government, or his black shirts would march on Rome and take it. The Italian army could have stopped them. The march was poorly organised, badly supplied, and would have been crushed without difficulty by a military that chose to act. Prime Minister Facta wanted to declare a state of emergency and do exactly that. But the decision required the signature of King Victor Emmanuel III, and the king hesitated. He was not sure of the army's loyalty. He was afraid of a civil war. He had been told by advisors whose interests happened to align with Mussolini's that the fascists were the only force that could save Italy from the chaos. And he did not sign. On the 30th of October 1922, the king invited Mussolini, who had spent the march waiting safely in Milan, not wanting to be in Rome if things went wrong, to become Prime Minister. Mussolini arrived in Rome by train. The march that followed was a victory parade. Power had been handed over before a single black shirt arrived. And this is the shape of the thing, the shape you will see again and again. The dictators of the 1930s did not seize power the way revolutions are imagined to work. They were invited in by people who thought they could control them, by people who found their violence useful, by people who had told themselves that the danger would be temporary, that the normal rules would reassert themselves, that the extremists would be moderated by responsibility. They were wrong about that. They are always wrong about that. Mussolini spent the next few years doing what all successful autocrats do. He moved slowly, not because he was cautious, but because the slow method works better. Each step taken alone looks like a reasonable response to a specific problem. The pattern only becomes visible when you look back at all the steps together, and by then, for the people living through it. Looking back is the only option left. He didn't declare a dictatorship immediately. He governed within the parliamentary system for 2 years, using it to consolidate his position, building his party's strength, using state resources and the implicit threat of black shirt violence to suppress opposition. Then, in June 1924, one of his agents kidnapped and murdered a socialist member of parliament named Giacomo Matteotti. The opposition parties walked out of Parliament in protest, in what became known as the Aventine succession, refusing to sit in a chamber that had been so corrupted. Mussolini appeared to be finished, but he was not. The opposition had walked out, which meant they were absent. Absent from the Parliament that was the only institution capable of removing him. They had gambled that the king would dismiss Mussolini in the face of such obvious criminality. The king didn't move. Without the king, without the military, without a legal system willing to act, the protest was theatre. Eloquent, morally correct theatre. Utterly ineffective theatre. On the 3rd of January 1925, Mussolini stood in Parliament and did something remarkable. He took personal and political responsibility for everything the fascists had done. He dared his critics to prosecute him. He knew they couldn't. And in the act of daring them, he demonstrated that they couldn't. And in that demonstration, he crossed from Prime Minister to dictator. Within a year, all political parties except the fascists were banned. The opposition press was shut down. The secret police force, the OVRA, was established to monitor and suppress dissent. The parliament was sidelined. Mussolini governed by decree. It had taken 3 years from the march on Rome to full dictatorship. 3 years during which, at any number of points, it might have been stopped. And it wasn't. The Church had been watching all of this. Pope Pius XI had called Mussolini a man sent by Providence, and he said it in the December of 1926, which is worth holding on to, because at that point the Church had not yet been given anything. That came later. In 1929, Mussolini signed the Lateran Pacts, settling a 50-year dispute between the Italian state and the Vatican, recognizing papal sovereignty over the small territory that became Vatican City, and making Catholicism the official religion of Italy. The Church, in return, lent its moral authority to a regime that needed all the legitimacy it could get. Mussolini called himself Il Duce, the leader. He had given the world its first modern fascist state, and to Europe's conservatives, its frightened middle classes, its old aristocracies, it looked like it was working. The story of Hitler's consolidation of power between January 1933 and August 1934 is a story of extraordinary speed, not because the speed was inevitable, but because the conditions were exactly right. The opposition was fatally divided, and Hitler moved with a ruthlessness his opponents consistently failed to anticipate. He had been Chancellor for less than a month when the Reichstag, the German Parliament building, caught fire. The date was the 27th of February 1933. a young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe, was found at the scene and arrested. Whether he acted alone or whether the Nazis helped the fire along is still argued about. What is not argued about is what happened next. The morning after the fire, Hitler had President Hindenburg sign an emergency decree suspending the basic civil rights of German citizens: free speech, freedom of assembly, the right to a fair trial, all suspended indefinitely in the name of national security. Within days, 4,000 communists were arrested. The elections that followed on the 5th of March were held in that climate. Nazi thugs were present at polling stations. The press had been largely silenced. And still, the Nazis only won with 43.9% of the vote. Not a majority, not even close, but enough combined with their nationalist coalition partners to control the chamber. On the 23rd of March 1933, the Reichstag met in a Berlin opera house lined with men in brown shirts. The SA, the party's own private army, there to be looked at. On the agenda, the Enabling Act, a law that would let Hitler rule by decree for 4 years, bypassing Parliament entirely. The Catholic Centre Party, calculating that cooperating might protect the Church's interests, voted in favour. The Social Democrats voted against. 94 of them, still present, still standing. Their chairman, Otto Wels, stood up and gave the only speech made against the act that day. It is the last genuinely free speech anyone made in that chamber. Freedom and life can be taken from us, but not our honour. The act passed, 441 votes to 94. It was the last meaningful vote the Reichstag could ever cast. What followed was rapid and systematic. In May, trade unions were abolished. In July, all political parties except the Nazis were banned. Germany became a one-party state in fewer than 6 months from the moment Hitler took the chancellorship. The whole apparatus of democratic life, the parties, the unions, the free press, the independent courts, were dismantled with legal-looking instruments passed by a parliament that had already surrendered the power to say no. But Hitler was not safe yet. There was a problem, and the problem was called the SA. The SA, the Sturmabteilung, the Storm Detachment, were the brown shirts, the street fighters, the men who had spent a decade brawling with communists in bars and alleyways and public squares, and who had made the Nazi rise to power possible by being willing to do that. In 1934, there were 3 million of them, and their leader, Ernst Röhm, wanted more. He wanted the SA to replace the professional German army. He wanted a second revolution. He wanted to continue the violence and the radicalism that had brought the Nazis to power in the first place. The German military loathed the SA and loathed Rome, and Hitler needed the army. On the night of the 30th of June 1934, Hitler moved. In what became known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler used the SS, the Schutzstaffel, the Protection Squad, a smaller and more disciplined black uniformed force that had until then lived in the SA shadow, to arrest and kill the SA leadership. Röhm was shot in his cell at Stadtheim prison. Over the following 2 days, somewhere between 85 and 200 people were murdered. SA leaders, yes, but also old political enemies, conservative figures who had annoyed the wrong people, individuals who were simply settling scores. The legal justification was invented afterwards. The German public was largely relieved. The SA had been violent and unpredictable. Hitler had restored order. The Reichstag, retrospectively, approved the murders as a necessary defence of the state. A few weeks later, Hindenburg died. He was 87. He had been the last constitutional barrier to Hitler's complete authority. The day before he died, the cabinet passed a law combining the roles of Chancellor and President into a single office. The moment Hindenburg stopped breathing, that law took effect. Hitler became Führer, supreme leader, head of state, commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Within hours, the entire German military swore a personal oath of loyalty, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, to Adolf Hitler by name until death. It had taken 18 months. From Chancellor to absolute dictator in 18 months. And it happened, for the most part, legally. The story of the dictators is not only the Italian story and the German story, though those are the ones that drove the war that followed. Across Europe in the 1930s, democracy was failing almost everywhere it had been tried. In Spain, a republic established in 1931 was already fracturing, torn between left and right, between reform and reaction, between a government trying to modernise a country and the army, the church and the landed class determined to prevent it. In July 1936, a group of military officers launched a coup. The coup failed to take the whole country, which meant it produced a civil war instead. 3 years of it. Around 500,000 people dead, and possibly more. General Francisco Franco, a cold and methodical military man from Galicia, emerged from the fighting as leader of the nationalist side. Hitler and Mussolini supplied him with weapons, ammunition, and something else, a proving ground. The skies over Spain became the place where the Luftwaffe learned how to fight a modern air war, and the German army field-tested tactics that would devastate Europe 3 years later. Franco won in April 1939. He would remain dictator of Spain until his death in 1975. And in the east there was Stalin. Joseph Stalin had been consolidating power in the Soviet Union since Lenin's death in 1924. A slower, more complicated process than Mussolini's or Hitler's, because the Communist Party was a different kind of institution from a liberal parliament, and dismantling it required different methods. By the late 1920s, he had outmaneuvered his rivals. By 1929, he was effectively the supreme authority in the USSR. What followed was on a scale the European fascists would not equal for years. Stalin launched the forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture in 1929. Millions of peasants were driven from their land. The kulaks, defined loosely as peasants who were slightly better off than the others, were declared class enemies and sent to labour camps, shot or deported to die in the frozen east. In Ukraine, the grain quotas were set deliberately beyond what the land could produce. The result was a famine, the Holodomor, that killed somewhere between 4 and 7 million people between 1932 and 1933. People starved in a country that was exporting grain. Then came the purges. In December 1934, a popular Communist Party official named Sergei Kirov was shot in Leningrad office. Whether Stalin ordered the assassination or simply used it is still argued about. What is not argued about is that he used it as a starting gun for what became the Great Terror. Over the following years, hundreds of thousands of people were arrested. Show trials were staged in which loyal Bolsheviks, men who had made the revolution, confessed to impossible conspiracies. Confessions extracted through torture, through threats to their families, through weeks without sleep in cells where the light was never turned off. The old guard of the Communist Party was almost entirely destroyed, and the senior command of the Red Army was gutted. 3 of the 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 50 of 57 corps commanders, shot or imprisoned in the years immediately before the war that was coming. At least 750,000 people were executed during the Great Terror of 1936 to 1938. More than 1 million were sent to the gulags. The scale is different from the fascist dictatorships. The ideology is different. The stated purpose is different. But the mechanism, fear as the instrument of control, the elimination of anyone capable of organizing opposition, the creation of a world in which no one can trust anyone, is recognizably the same. So what connects all of these? None of these men took power the way dictators are supposed to take power in the imagination of people who had never watched a dictatorship being built from the inside. They were not foreign invaders. They were not alien forces descending on otherwise healthy societies. They came from within. They used the mechanisms of the democracies they were destroying, elections, emergency legislation, parliamentary procedure, legal forms, to dismantle the protections those mechanisms were supposed to guarantee. They were invited in by people who miscalculated, by conservatives who thought the extremists could be managed, by traditional elites who found the violence against the left more useful than alarming, by frightened middle classes who had lost their savings and their certainty and wanted someone to blame and someone to fix it, and found, in the men with the simple stories and the black uniforms, something that felt like an answer. The democracies that fell in the 1930s did not fall because the people were stupid. They fell because the people were frightened. And because the institutions that were supposed to hold, the courts, the press, the parliamentary opposition, the military, were either captured, corrupted, or too slow. Each step looked survivable. The emergency decree, the dissolved trade unions, the banned opposition party. Each one on its own could be rationalized. The people who objected to each step were called alarmists, extremists, enemies of the order. And by the time the full shape of the thing was visible, it was too late to stop it by the ordinary means democracy used to stop things. The question people always ask, how did ordinary people let this happen, has an uncomfortable second half. The second half is this: what makes you think you would be different? Most of the people who lived through the rise of the dictators were not complicit. They were not enthusiastic. They were not cruel. They were ordinary people going to work, feeding their children, worrying about money, trying to keep their heads down while the world changed around them. They made the calculations that frightened people in impossible situations make. They weighed the cost of resistance against the cost of compliance, and they chose a path that looked safer for their families. That does not make what happened forgivable, but it makes it human. And making it human is the only thing that makes it usable. The only thing that turns it from a cautionary tale about other people into something that might, if you're paying attention, be recognizable while it is still in the making. In 1939, a German journalist named Sebastian Hefner sat down in exile in England and started writing a memoir he would never finish. He wrote about what it had been like to live through the transformation of Germany between 1914 and 1933. Not from the perspective of politics, from the perspective of daily life, what it felt like from the inside. He wrote about the Reichstag fire, about the collapse of the opposition, about the steady erosion of freedom underneath a surface that looked ordinary. And he asked the question the whole book is really circling. Why did no one, not the leaders, but ordinary individual people, spontaneously resist the specific injustices they watched happen in front of them? His answer was that they were prevented by what he called the mechanical continuation of normal daily life. He wasn't condemning them. He was describing a process. The word for that process, in German, was Gleichschaltung, coordination, the bringing of everything into alignment with a new order. The press, the courts, the schools, the professional associations, the churches, the cultural institutions, one by one they adjusted. Some because they believed, some because they feared. Most because the daily cost of not adjusting seemed higher than the daily cost of going along, and life, in the gaps between the catastrophes, continued to feel mostly normal. That is the part that never quite survives the retelling. The clean chronology, the tidy chapter headings, none of it carries the thing that actually mattered most to the people who were there. It didn't feel like history while it was happening. It felt like life. In September of 1939, what had been built in those years would become impossible to mistake for anything else. But we're not there yet. First, there are a few more years to account for. A few more rooms full of exhausted men telling themselves that the man with the simple stories and the absolute certainty can still be handed something small and made to stop. Next time, we are going to sit with the men who looked away. The Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, Munich. How the leaders of Britain and France made a series of calculations that each seemed reasonable on the day it was made, and together made the war certain. What it cost them. What it cost everyone else. Sleep well. This has been the Sleepy Soldier. If you fell asleep before the end, you were listening in the right way. Good night.